The second she hung up the phone, my stomach sank. Because I knew that with Karen's history of manipulation, she would spin the situation to the police in whatever way painted her as the poor HOA president being harassed by a reckless neighbor, and if I didn't hold myself together, it could very well backfire on me. So, I forced myself to stay calm, even though I wanted to shout at the top of my lungs. And instead I pulled out my own phone, quickly dialing my wife and telling her to come outside with me so that there would be another witness standing by when officers arrived, because I knew I couldn't rely on Karen's husband, who by the look of guilt and fear on his face wasn't going to back me up even if he wanted. 2, since she had him wrapped around her finger just like she had most of the HOA board, as I stood there, glaring at her while she prattled on about how I had stormed onto her property and threatened to steal an RV that was clearly parked in front of her house. I couldn't help but think back to all the other times she had pulled stunts like this, writing fake citations to neighbors for trivial things like garden gnomes, demanding that people repaint their fences because the shade of beige wasn't uniform enough. And even once finding a family for leaving their Christmas lights up in January, but this was theft, plain and simple, and yet she had the audacity to frame me as the aggressor, which only fueled my determination not to let her walk away with it this time. Within 10 minutes, the familiar flashing lights of a police cruiser turned into the cul-de-sac, and my wife came hurrying down the driveway at the same moment. Confusion etched on her face as she took in the sight of our RV packed with Karen's family's belongings like it was their personal vacation wagon. The officer stepped out, and of course, Karen immediately rushed forward, crocodile tears streaming down her face as she pointed at me and exclaimed, "That's him. That's the neighbor I was telling you about. He threatened me, and he's trying to steal this RV from me and my family. We were just preparing for a family trip, and he barged onto our property yelling and frightening us." I wanted to laugh at the sheer insanity of her story, but I knew laughing would make me look unstable, so instead, I raised my hands in a calm, open gesture and waited until the officers asked for my side of the story. "Officer, with all due respect, this is my RV," I explained, gesturing toward the vehicle. "It was parked in my driveway when I left town 2 days ago. Came back this morning to find it moved here, in front of her house, with all of her things loaded into it. You can check the registration, it's in my name." She's trying to take it for herself. My wife jumped in quickly, adding, "We were gone, and he came back early. Our driveway was empty because she took it. That's why we're standing here now." The officers glanced between us and then toward the RV, clearly trying to assess who was telling the truth, though I noticed one of them raise his eyebrows when he saw Karen's husband sheepishly holding 2 sleeping bags and a camping lantern, which definitely didn't help her case. "Ma'am, do you have proof of ownership for this RV?" one officer asked Karen. Her expression faltered for the first time, and she stammered something about community property and HOA rights over vehicles parked improperly, which made my blood boil again because she was trying to twist HOA bylaws into justifying outright theft. But when pressed further, she couldn't produce a single shred of documentation tying her to the RV. Meanwhile, "I can grab the title and registration from my safe inside the house right now," I said firmly, and within a minute, my wife returned with the papers that proved without a doubt that the RV was mine. The officers inspected them carefully and then turned back to Karen, whose face was now a mask of fury thinly veiled under a fake polite smile. "Ma'am, this doesn't look good," one officer said pointedly. "You called us claiming this vehicle belonged to you, but the documents clearly state otherwise." Karen quickly shifted tactics, clasping her hands together as she tried to play the victim card again. "I was only trying to help the neighborhood," she pleaded, her voice trembling as though she were on the verge of tears. The RV was an eyesore and it violated the HOA's covenant. I was relocating it until we could hold a hearing about it. That's all. He became aggressive, and I feared for my safety. The officers didn't look convinced, but they also didn't seem ready to slap handcuffs on her either, which frustrated me because if the roles had been reversed, I had no doubt I'd already be sitting in the back of that squad car. "Sir, did you threaten her in any way?" one of the officers asked me directly. "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "I confronted her, yes, because she stole my property, but threaten her? No, she's twisting the truth. My wife nodded vigorously in agreement, and even Karen's husband muttered under his breath. He didn't threaten her, which earned him a sharp glare from Karen, but also worked in my favor. At that point, the officers seemed satisfied, enough to defuse the situation without arrests. But they warned Karen sternly to keep her hands off property that didn't belong to her. They told me I was within my rights to press charges for attempted theft. I could tell they were hoping I wouldn't escalate things further in that moment. So I bit my tongue, though inside I was seething, because I knew Karen if I let this slide, she wouldn't stop. She'd find another angle, another excuse, another way to harass me and try to claim what wasn't hers. And as I stood there watching her retreat back into her house, hissing at her husband to follow, I realized that if I wanted this nightmare to end, I couldn't just defend myself. I was going to have to come up with a plan to put an end to Karen's games once and for all, something that would leave her no wiggle room, no way to twist the story, no escape from the consequences of her actions. That night, after the police left and the adrenaline finally began to drain out of me, I sat in the RV with my wife, still staring at the boxes and bags of Karen's belongings that were crammed inside as if it were her personal storage unit. And even though the officers had warned her to leave me alone, I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried again, because Karen was not the kind of woman who admitted defeat. She was the kind who doubled down and twisted every setback into some new scheme, and I couldn't shake the thought that if I didn't take action soon, she would eventually succeed in getting me in trouble or worse. So I began sketching out a plan, not reckless or angry, but methodical and deliberate. Because if Karen wanted to play HOA politics and manipulation, then I needed to play smarter, with evidence and leverage. And that meant starting with cameras. Lots of cameras, covering every angle of my property so that the next time she so much as stepped foot near my driveway, I would have proof to shove in her face and to show the police without hesitation. My wife agreed, though she was nervous, because she'd seen Karen turn neighbors against one another before. And she worried that if I escalated, Karen would rally the whole HOA board behind her. But I reassured her that this wasn't escalation, it was protection. It was making sure that the next time Karen crossed the line, she couldn't twist the story, because the truth would be undeniable. The next morning, I drove into town and picked up a set of security cameras, motion lights, and even a GPS tracker for the RV, because if she had the gall to physically move it once, I wasn't putting it past her to try again. By that afternoon, I had the cameras mounted on the garage, the porch, and even a small one tucked discreetly into a tree that overlooked the street, all feeding live footage to my phone. My wife thought I was going overboard, but I told her it was only temporary, just until Karen finally overstepped so badly that she couldn't weasel her way out of it. And sure enough, it didn't take long. 2 nights later, around midnight, I got an alert on my phone motion detected near the RV end when I pulled up the live feed. There she was, Karen herself, flashlight in hand, pacing around the RV end, scribbling something on her ever-present HOA clipboard, muttering to herself as she peered at the license plate and tapped the door handle as if testing whether it was locked. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm, to let her dig her own hole. And after about 10 minutes, she finally scurried back toward her house. And the next morning, I found a bright yellow citation taped to my RV windshield, declaring that it was in violation of some fabricated HOA rule about extended driveway parking, and demanding that it be relocated or subject to community action. It was so outrageous that I laughed out loud. But the laugh quickly turned into determination, because this was exactly the kind of harassment I needed to document. I snapped photos, saved the video footage, and tucked everything into a folder. On my computer, labeled simply Karen Evidence. Over the next week, it became a pattern: Karen lurking at odd hours, snapping photos of my yard, pacing around the RV, leaving bogus citations and warnings taped to my door. And each time, I added another clip, another photo, another piece of proof to my growing file. But then, just as I was feeling confident that I was building an airtight case, she upped the ante in a way that I never expected. One Saturday afternoon, I came home from running errands to find my driveway completely empty, again the RV was gone. My heart stopped because I had locked it, set the GPS tracker, even installed a steering wheel club. and yet somehow, someone had managed to move it without me noticing. My wife came running out of the house in a panic, shouting that she had been in the backyard gardening when she heard the engine start. But by the time she ran to the front, the RV was already pulling away with Karen at the wheel and her husband. Trailing behind in their SUV, I didn't waste a second. I pulled up the GPS tracker app and saw the little red DOT moving steadily down the highway heading west, and I jumped into my truck and sped off after it, my wife beside me clutching her phone to record everything. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, chasing my own stolen RV down the interstate. And as we closed the distance, I could see Karen's blonde hair through the driver's window, her sunglasses perched on her face as though this were the most normal thing in the world, like she had every right to be driving my vehicle. I called 911 on speaker, breathless as I explained the situation.
And tell.
Dispatcher told me to keep a safe distance while officers were sent to intercept. But I couldn't resist pulling up close enough to film her behind the wheel, proof that she had once again crossed the line into outright theft. Eventually, flashing lights appeared behind us. Karen, realizing she was caught, pulled over to the shoulder with a smug little smirk on her face, like she still thought she could talk her way out of it. The officers approached, and for a moment I feared she'd spin the same story as before. But this time, I had everything: the video from my cameras showing her climbing into the RV, the GPS tracker data, the live footage my wife had filmed of her driving it, and when I presented it all in front of the officers, there was no room for doubt. Karen tried to protest, babbling about community repossession and HOA authority. But the officers shut her down quickly, telling her she had no legal right to commandeer someone else's property. They made her step out of the RV, and for the first time, I saw something crack in her confidence. The smirk slipping into something closer to panic, though she still held her chin high as though she were the victim. The officers told me once again that I could press charges, and this time, I didn't hesitate. Tay told them I wanted to proceed, that enough was enough, that this was theft and harassment, and I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. They took statements, collected my evidence, and even towed Karen's SUV when they discovered it had expired registration, which felt like a small but satisfying bit of karma. As they led Karen into the back of the squad car, she turned to glare at me with such venom that I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for once, I felt like I had the upper hand, because I had the law, the truth, and undeniable proof on my side. Still, as I watched the cruiser pull away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Karen wasn't the kind of person to go quietly. And if she had managed to manipulate the HOA board all this time, who was to say she wouldn't find a way to spin even this disaster into another attack against me? The silence after Karen's second arrest didn't last long, because while most of the neighbors were finally beginning to breathe easier, whispering to each other that maybe now she would be locked away for good, I knew deep down that she was too resourceful, too manipulative, to let this be the end. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, I received yet another thick envelope in the mail. This one not from the HOA, but from a law office representing Karen herself, claiming wrongful arrest, defamation, harassment, and even unlawful interference with HOA governance. And as I flipped through the pages of legal jargon, I felt both anger and disbelief at the audacity of it, because this woman had been caught red-handed trying to steal my RV, had fabricated documents, had called 911 on me in an attempt to flip the story, yet here she was now, weaponizing the legal system against me as though she were the victim. My wife was furious, pacing the living room and asking how someone could lie so boldly on official documents. And though I reassured her that truth was on our side, I also knew that fighting someone like Karen meant more than just presenting facts. It meant enduring the endless harassment, the games, the smear campaigns. And sure enough, I soon noticed subtle but deliberate changes in how some of the neighbors treated us. A couple of families who used to wave stopped making eye contact, while others whispered when I walked by. It didn't take long to figure out why. Karen had been making phone calls from jail, spinning her narrative that I was the troublemaker, that I was targeting her unfairly, and that the HOA was under siege because of me. It was sickening to realize how deep her manipulations ran, But instead of letting it break me, I decided to get ahead of it by documenting everything even more carefully. Every phone call, every letter, every interaction, and I even installed extra cameras around the property to ensure that if anyone tried to intimidate us or damage our RV again, I would have undeniable evidence. That preparation paid off sooner than I expected, because one night, just after midnight, the cameras picked up movement near the RV. And when I checked the feed, I saw two figures crouching by the tires, trying to slash them, and though their faces were covered, their movements, their build, were all too familiar. They were Karen's teenage sons, the same ones who had once egged my house after she riled them up about community loyalty. I immediately called the police, and though the boys tried to run, they were caught only a block away, with the knife still in one of their hands. And once again, Karen's circle of chaos widened to include her own family, dragging them deeper into her vendetta. The fallout was immediate. Several neighbors who had been on the fence suddenly realized that this wasn't just a petty squabble, it was a dangerous obsession, and I finally began receiving quiet support from people who had once stayed silent, dropping by to say they were sorry for not speaking up sooner, offering to testify on my behalf if things escalated further. And escalate they did, because at the next HOA meeting, even without Karen present, her influence was palpable. One of her closest allies on the board stood up and declared that the HOA would be pursuing emergency action to enforce fines against me, claiming that my conflict with Karen had brought disrepute to the neighborhood, and for a moment, it felt like the walls were closing in again, as if no matter how much evidence I had, no matter how many times she exposed herself as the aggressor, she always found some way to twist the system in her favor. But this time I was ready. I stood up in front of everyone, projected footage from my security cameras onto the meeting hall wall, showing her sons caught in the act. Replayed audio of Karen screaming false accusations at me the night she tried to steal the RV, and even handed out copies of the police reports documenting every single incident. And when I finished, the room was silent except for the sound of a few neighbors murmuring in agreement that enough was enough. For the first time, I saw real fear in the eyes of her supporters, as if they finally realized that Karen wasn't just difficult, she was dangerous. Continuing to enable her could backfire on them too. The board backed down that night, rescinding the threatened fines and agreeing to hold an independent review of Karen's actions. And though I knew she would never accept defeat quietly, it was the first real crack in her empire of control. But Karen's rage from jail was palpable, even from a distance, because the very next day, I received a voicemail from an unknown number, and when I played it, my blood ran cold. It was her voice. It's distorted slightly but unmistakable, vowing that she would destroy me, that I hadn't seen the last of her, and that when she got out, I would regret ever crossing the queen of this neighborhood. My wife begged me to take it straight to the police, and I did, handing over the recording. But I also knew that threats were only the beginning. Karen was desperate now, and desperation made her even more unpredictable. Nights felt longer, shadows felt heavier, and every time a car slowed near our house, I found myself tensing, waiting for the next strike, because deep down I knew she wasn't done. And the battle for peace in our own home was far from over. Asterisk. It all started on a Friday morning when I decided to cut my trip short and come back home 2 days earlier than planned. And little did I know, returning early would lead to one of the most shocking encounters I had ever experienced with my HOAs. Infamous Karen. Before I dive into the details, make sure you stick around until the end, because this story is not only about betrayal and lies, but also about how standing your ground can turn the tables completely. And if you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories so you won't miss the next jaw-dropping twist. I had taken my family out for what was supposed to be a week-long camping trip in the mountains. Using our beloved RV that I had worked hard to buy and maintain over the years, it wasn't just a vehicle to me. It was a piece of freedom, something I could take anywhere, to escape the stress of work and the suffocating rules of the HOA. But we had some unexpected weather changes, and my wife wasn't feeling great, so we decided to pack up early and return home. As I pulled into the neighborhood, I immediately noticed something odd. My driveway, where my RV should have been parked, was empty. My first thought was panic. Did someone steal it? I jumped out of my truck and ran to the side yard, checking the locked gate. And that's when I noticed faint tire marks leading out from the driveway, as though the RV had been carefully driven away rather than stolen in a rush. My heart started pounding. Then, as I glanced down the street, I froze. At the corner of the cul-de-sac, there was my RV, parked right outside Karen's house. My stomach twisted. I could see the blinds in her windows twitching, and then the front door swung open. Karen herself stepped out, holding an armful of beach towels and a picnic basket, like she was preparing for some kind of family getaway. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was stealing my RV. It wasn't just that she had moved it. She had opened it up, loaded it, and clearly planned to drive off with her family as if it belonged to her. My shock quickly turned into rage, and I stormed down the sidewalk toward her house. She spotted me and froze, her jaw dropping like she had seen a ghost. "What are you doing back so early?" she stammered, clutching the basket tighter. That question alone told me everything. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't even pretending she hadn't touched it. She'd already laid claim to my property, as if it was hers to take. "What do you mean? What am I doing back?" I shot back, my voice rising. "What are you doing with my RV?" Her face flushed red, and she tried to wave me off. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said, her tone shifting from surprise to that arrogant, condescending voice she always used whenever she tried to boss the neighbors around. "The HOA has rules against oversized vehicles and driveways. I was simply relocating it until we could sort this out properly. Besides, you weren't even using it. My family needed it this weekend." My blood boiled at her audacity. "Relocating it? You were stealing it? You don't get to take my property because you feel entitled to it," I snapped. At that point, her husband came out, looking embarrassed, but also loaded down with pillows and sleeping bags, clearly ready for the trip. He muttered something about, maybe we should just go back inside, but Karen wasn't having it. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, did what she always did when she realized she was caught. She went on the offensive. "If you're going to speak to me like that, I'll call the authorities right now," she said, pulling her phone from her pocket. I almost laughed, thinking she couldn't possibly be serious. But before I could respond, she dialed 911 right there in front of me. "Hello, yes," she said loudly, glaring at me as though I were the criminal. "This is Karen from the Lakeside HOA. I need officers sent immediately. One of my neighbors is threatening me and trying to steal an RV parked in front of my home." I couldn't believe my ears. She had flipped the story entirely and was making herself the victim. My heart sank as I realized this wasn't just her usual bullying. This was dangerous. I knew once the police got involved, things could spiral out of control quickly. But I also knew I had one thing on my side, the truth.
Ow.
And I was determined that Karen wasn't going to win this time. The days that followed Karen's arrest were strangely quiet, almost too quiet. And at first I allowed myself to breathe easier, thinking that maybe this time she had finally been forced to back down. But deep down I knew it wasn't over, because people like Karen didn't stop. They regrouped. They plotted, and they struck again, and sure enough, only a week later, I got the first sign of her next move when a formal-looking letter arrived in the mail, stamped with the HOAS seal and written in the kind of pompous, bureaucratic language. That immediately set my teeth on edge, because it accused me of ongoing violations of community regulations, citing everything from unsightly property storage to vehicle nuisance and even disturbance of neighborhood harmony, which was laughable considering that the only disturbance came from Karen herself, yet the letter concluded with a threat of fines, legal action, and even potential foreclosure proceedings if I didn't comply with their demands to remove the RV permanently, repaint my house to match HOA standards, and submit to a full property inspection within 30 days. My wife was livid, waving the letter in the air and shouting that this was Karen's doing. That even behind bars, she had somehow gotten her claws into the board, and the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Because Karen had always boasted about her connections, her influence over the HOA, and now she was pulling strings even from the shadows. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to roll over. And I began attending the HOA meetings, not quietly, but with a binder full of evidence, photos, videos, police reports, copies of every bogus citation Karen had taped to my RV. I laid it all out in front of the board, demanding that they explain how one woman had been allowed to weaponize the HOA against her neighbors. The reaction was mixed. A few members looked genuinely shocked, whispering among themselves as they flipped through my documentation. But others, the ones who had always fawned over Karen, shifted uncomfortably and tried to redirect the conversation, insisting that the matter was complicated and that I was misinterpreting HOA regulations. It was infuriating, but I could see the cracks forming. Could see that at least some of the board members were starting to question the narrative Karen had fed them, and I knew that if I kept pushing, kept exposing the truth, eventually she would lose her grip. But Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. Because 2 nights after that meeting, just when I thought I might finally be making headway, I was jolted awake by the blaring of car horns and flashing lights outside, and when I rushed to the window, I saw 3 HOA security patrol cars parked across my driveway, their hazard lights flashing like some kind of amateur police barricade. And standing in the middle of it all was none other than Karen herself, out of jail and smug as ever, flanked by 2 board members who looked uncomfortable but complicit. My wife gasped in disbelief, asking how she was out already. I could only guess that she had pulled strings, posted bail. Maybe even twisted the story to paint herself as the victim, because when I stormed outside demanding to know what was going on, Karen held up a folder of papers and announced loudly enough for the whole street to hear that I was in violation of Emergency Community Seizure Authority, claiming that the HOA had voted to confiscate my RV and issue me fines, until further notice. It was absurd, outrageous, and completely illegal. But the sight of her standing there with that smug smirk, barking orders as if she were some kind of sheriff, made my blood boil. I pulled out my phone to start recording, narrating every detail as I asked her point blank whether she realized she was trespassing and impersonating authority yet again. For a flicker of a second, I saw doubt flash across her face, but she quickly covered it with bravado, waving her papers in the air and insisting that I was endangering community harmony. Neighbors began to gather, some filming, others whispering, and I knew this was my chance. So I loudly recounted everything she had done: the break-ins, theft, citations, the police reports, while holding my phone steady on her face. And the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, no longer looking at me as the problem, but at her as the lunatic she truly was. Karen tried to rally the board members, hissing at them to back her up, but one of them finally spoke up, saying maybe this had gone too far, maybe this wasn't legal, and Karen's composure slipped as she snapped at him in front of everyone, her mask of control cracking. That's when the real police showed up, responding to the chaos of flashing lights and honking horns, and the moment they stepped onto the scene, Karen's entire facade crumbled, because this time it wasn't just me pointing fingers, it was half the neighborhood watching her antics, half the neighborhood recording her behavior, and even the board members distancing themselves as they realized they didn't want to be dragged down with her. The officers demanded an explanation, and Karen, wild-eyed now, tried to thrust her authority papers at them. But when they read through them and saw that they were nothing more than doctored HOA forms, their patience ran out. They told her flatly that she was interfering with private property, that she was inciting a public disturbance, and that she was in violation of the very bail conditions that had allowed her release. I'll never forget the look on her face when they cuffed her in front of the entire neighborhood, her eyes darting wildly as though she couldn't comprehend that her power, her influence, her carefully curated control was collapsing right there, on the sidewalk. And for once, the only sound from the gathered neighbors was a murmur of agreement that maybe Karen had finally gone too far. As they shoved her into the back of the cruiser, I felt a rush of relief, but also a nagging awareness that, with someone like Karen, nothing was ever final, because people like her didn't learn lessons, they plotted revenge, and I couldn't shake the uneasy thought that even behind bars, she was already thinking of her next move, already scheming some way to turn the HOA, the neighbors, maybe even the legal system itself, back against me. The following days blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and gnawing tension. Because even though Karen had been caught on my cameras creeping around my RV like some deranged predator marking her territory, the police told me their hands were tied unless she physically damaged the property or trespassed onto my driveway. And that loophole was all she needed to continue her psychological warfare. Lingering near the curb at odd hours, chatting loudly with her remaining supporters about how justice would come for me soon, and planting seeds of fear that grew like weeds inside my household. My wife jumped at every noise. My kids begged me to sell the RV and move, but I refused.
Ow!
Because running would have meant that Karen's campaign of intimidation had succeeded, and I had promised myself and my family that this nightmare would end with truth, not surrender. I threw myself into gathering every last shred of evidence, organizing binders thicker than phone books filled with photos, videos, logs of her harassment, police reports, and the damning voicemail that still made my skin crawl. And when my attorney finally confirmed that the court date had been set, I felt something I hadn't in months hope, a fragile but steady spark that maybe, just maybe, justice was within reach. But Karen wasn't finished, and in typical fashion, her final strike was her boldest yet, because 3 nights before the hearing, the shrill blare of sirens split the stillness of our street, and suddenly squad cars were pulling up to my house. Lights flashing, officers piling out with weapons drawn, ordering me to step outside with my hands up. And the terror in my children's screams nearly shattered me, because I knew instantly who was behind it. One of the officers barked that they had received a 911 call reporting a violent domestic disturbance at my address, complete with claims of screaming children and the sound of gunfire. And as I stood there on my lawn with my hands raised, the red and blue lights painting my home in chaos, I realized Karen had just staged a swatting, a dangerous escalation that could have cost me my life. Thankfully, after a tense half hour, and my security footage quickly debunking the false report, the officers lowered their weapons, their tone shifting from aggression to frustration, one of them muttering that they were getting real tired of this address, but the damage had already been done, because my children clung to my wife sobbing uncontrollably, traumatized by the sight of their father, treated like a criminal, and inside me burned a fury hotter than anything I had felt before. The next morning, I sat across from my attorney, slamming the latest police report onto his desk, demanding we bring the full weight of the law down on Karen. Not just for harassment, but for endangerment, fraud, and malicious misuse of emergency services. And he nodded grimly, assuring me that swatting was a federal offense, and this time there would be no escaping accountability. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed, neighbors, reporters, even curious strangers drawn by the sensational headlines the local journalist had run about. HOA queen turned suburb into war zone, and as Karen strutted, and wearing her trademark smug grin, I felt my stomach knot. But I also knew she wasn't untouchable anymore, not with the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The prosecution laid everything out in meticulous detail: the attempted theft of my RV, the harassment letters, the child endangering scheme, the fabricated CPS call, the late-night trespassing caught on camera, and finally, the swatting that could have ended in tragedy, each piece hammering nails into the coffin of her credibility. Karen, of course, tried to twist it all, claiming she was the real victim, that I had orchestrated an elaborate smear campaign against her. But when the judge played the voicemail aloud, her voice dripping with venom, threatening to ruin me and my family, the last of her masks slipped, and the jury's expressions hardened with disgust. By the time the verdict came down guilty on multiple counts of harassment, fraud, and misuse of emergency services, the courtroom erupted in murmurs, some neighbors gasping, others whispering prayers of relief, and Karen's face contorted with rage as she realized the walls she had built around herself were crumbling at last. Sentencing would come later, but knowing she was going behind bars, truly this time, lifted a weight from my shoulders I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Walking out of that courthouse, my wife's hand in mine, the sun felt warmer, the air clearer, and for the first time in months, I believed we could truly begin to heal, rebuild the sense of peace Karen had stolen from us. The neighborhood changed after that. The HOA scrambled to reorganize. Many of her former allies resigned in shame, and while scars lingered, there was a newfound unity among the residents. as if surviving Karen's reign of terror had bonded us together in a way nothing else could have. The RV, once the symbol of everything Karen had tried to take from me, became a beacon of resilience. And that summer I finally took my family on the trip we had been planning before all the chaos began, driving away from the neighborhood, not in fear, but in triumph. My kids laughing in the back seat as miles of open road stretched before us. Yet even as I watched the sunset from the RV's window, I couldn't shake the haunting thought of how close it all came to spiraling into irreversible tragedy. How one person's obsession with control and power had nearly destroyed lives. And I knew others out there were living their own versions of this nightmare, under the thumb of their own Karens. So let this story be a warning, a reminder, and an inspiration. Bullies thrive on silence, on fear, on people giving up. But when you stand your ground, when you shine light on their darkest tactics, you can win. And if you want to hear more, true jaw-dropping tales of HOA chaos, neighbor wars, and justice finally served, then make sure you hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The days following that threatening voicemail dragged on with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself was charged with static. Because even though Karen was physically locked away, her influence bled through the bars. And I couldn't shake the feeling that she had strings left to pull, loyalists willing to act in her name. And sure enough, that paranoia proved justified when one evening, I came home from work to find a letter nailed to my front door, written in thick red marker that screamed traitor to the community. And beneath those words, stapled to the wood, was a blurry photo of me loading camping gear into my RV, as if to remind me that they were still watching, still tracking my every move. My wife was shaken, demanding we pack up and leave the neighborhood altogether. But I refused to let Karen's madness chase us from the home we had built. The pool we had poured our savings into, the RV we had worked years to afford. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle, about not surrendering to someone who thrived on intimidation. And so I doubled down, upgrading our security, looping in the police at every step, and even consulting with an attorney who specialized in harassment cases. The attorney was blunt, telling me that while the law was on my side, the process would be slow and grueling, because Karen knew how to exploit every loophole, every delay. But he also said something that stuck with me. Bullies only win when you let exhaustion do their job for them. And that simple truth hardened my resolve. Then, almost like clockwork, the HOA board called for another special emergency session, claiming they needed to address ongoing unrest caused by one member's actions. And I knew before I even walked in that the finger would be pointed squarely at me, because Karen's allies were desperate to shift the narrative back in her favor. The meeting was tense, with neighbors split down the middle, some tired of the drama and wishing I would just let things go. Others furious that Karen had dragged the entire community into her personal vendetta. But when one of her staunch supporters stood up and demanded that I be banned from attending future meetings for inciting hostility, I snapped, pulling out my phone, projecting the threatening voicemail Karen had left for me, and letting every single person in that room hear her venom for themselves. The effect was immediate gasps, shocked stares, a few mutters of "she's gone too far." And for the first time, the board members who had been shielding her looked visibly shaken, as though they had finally realized that defending her any further could expose them to liability too. The motion to ban me died in silence, no one daring to second it. And though I left the meeting without celebration, I felt a glimmer of hope that Karen's stranglehold on the HOA was weakening. But just when it seemed the tide might be turning, another curveball hit an anonymous tip to Child Protective Services, claiming that I was endangering my own children by storing toxic chemicals in our garage and allowing them near hazardous vehicles. And when two agents showed up at our door, clipboards in hand, asking to inspect the premises, my wife nearly collapsed in rage and exhaustion, because it was so clearly another move from Karen's playbook, another way to weaponize systems of authority against us. Thankfully, the agents were professional, quickly realizing the complaint was baseless. But the damage was emotional, the humiliation of having to defend ourselves against fabricated charges, the constant dread of wondering what system she would corrupt next. I sat my family down that night and promised them that no matter how long it took, we would end this once and for all. Not by running, not by hiding, but by exposing Karen's full scope of manipulation to every authority, every neighbor, every system she thought she could twist. And I began preparing for what I suspected would be the final confrontation. My attorney filed motions to have her harassment formally addressed in court. I gathered every piece of evidence into organized binders with timestamps and police reports, and I even reached out to a local journalist who had been covering stories of HOA abuse, offering her full access to my documentation. The journalist's eyes widened as she read through Karen's pattern of behavior, muttering that this was bigger than a neighborhood dispute, that it was a cautionary tale about unchecked power and manipulation, and though part of me feared going public would escalate things further, another part of me craved the sunlight of exposure, because Karen's strength had always come from working in the shadows, whispering lies, sowing division, and now I was determined to drag everything into the light. But before the article could even be written, Karen made her next move. Her bail was granted, and within hours of her release, she was back in the neighborhood, strutting down the street as though nothing had happened, her chin high, her smile mocking, and when she locked eyes with me across my driveway, she mouthed the words, "I told you I'd be back." My wife clutched my arm, urging me not to take the bait, but the fury that rose inside me was almost uncontrollable. Because here was a woman who had broken laws, terrorized her neighbors, dragged her own children into crime, yet still managed to walk free, emboldened by a system too slow to keep up with her manipulation. That night, I barely slept, knowing she was only steps away, plotting, scheming, waiting for her chance to strike again. And when the faint sound of footsteps near the RV woke me at 3 a.m., I bolted upright, heart pounding, rushing to the cameras, only to see the grainy footage of Karen herself circling the vehicle, running her hand along its side as though claiming it once again as her own. And when she looked directly into the lens and waved, a sick grin spreading across her face, I knew beyond a doubt that the battle had reached its most dangerous stage yet, and that whatever came next would determine not just the safety of my RV, but the future of our entire home and family.